When 28-year-old diesel mechanic Rosalind Kellerman accepted a deteriorating 1967 Ford pickup as payment for an unpaid repair bill, she thought she was just cutting her losses on another broke customer. But hidden within the truck's rusted frame was a trail of clues that would lead her to a reclusive millionaire's deathbed confession, expose a decades-old cover-up involving her own family, and force her to choose between financial security and uncovering a truth that powerful people had worked for 50 years to bury. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, I've got something even more extraordinary lined up for you. The November wind howled through the open bay doors of Kellerman's Automotive and Diesel Repair, carrying with it the sharp scent of approaching snow and motor oil that had long since soaked into the concrete floor. Rosalind Kellerman, Ros to everyone who knew her, wiped transmission fluid from her forearms with a shop rag so stained it was impossible to tell what color it had originally been. Her hands bore the marks of a decade spent in a profession that still made some customers do a double take when they saw her emerge from beneath a lifted F-350. The garage sat on the eastern edge of Millbrook Ridge, Montana, a town of 4,100 souls clinging to existence in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. What had once been a thriving stop along Highway 93, back when people actually drove through instead of around, had slowly withered after the interstate bypass opened 3 years ago. The promise had been economic development farther north. The reality had been empty storefronts, for sale signs, and businesses that had served 3 generations suddenly struggling to survive another season. Ros walked to the small office attached to the main garage bay, her steel-toed boots leaving faint prints on the dusty floor. The space was cramped but organized, her father's old desk against one wall, a filing cabinet with a coffee maker balanced precariously on top, and walls covered with faded photographs of the garage's glory days. Pictures of her father, Malcolm Kellerman, grinning beside freshly repaired logging trucks and ranchers' pickups. Malcolm with his arm around a teenage Ros, both of them covered in grease, holding up a rebuilt carburetor like a trophy. Malcolm had opened his garage in 1983, when Millbrook Ridge was still a genuine crossroads town. He'd built a reputation as the best diesel mechanic in 3 counties, the guy who could diagnose a problem by the sound of an engine, who never cut corners, who treated every customer's vehicle like it was his own prized possession. He'd taught Ros everything, starting when she was 8 years old and could barely hold a wrench. Mechanics isn't just fixing broken things, he'd told her countless times. It's understanding how things work, why they fail, and having the patience to bring them back to life. Most people give up too easy. Not us, Rosie. We don't quit on machines, and we don't quit on people. Malcolm Kellerman had died 4 years ago at 56, a massive coronary while replacing a clutch on a Peterbilt semi. One moment he was there, laughing at something on the radio. The next, he was gone, leaving Ros with a thriving business, a solid reputation, and $220,000 in commercial loans he'd taken out to expand and modernize the shop 18 months before the bypass was announced. Nobody had known the bypass was coming. The state had kept it quiet until after the route was finalized, leaving business owners like Malcolm scrambling to adapt. He'd borrowed heavily to add a second bay, upgrade all the equipment, and purchase diagnostic computers for modern vehicles. The plan had made sense when Highway 93 carried thousands of travelers daily through downtown Millbrook Ridge. It made no sense at all when that traffic disappeared overnight. Now, at 28, Ros was the sole proprietor of a business hemorrhaging money. She was 4 months behind on the commercial loan payments. The bank had started sending formal notices, polite at first, now increasingly urgent. She'd sold off some of the newer diagnostic equipment to make partial payments, but it wasn't enough. The equipment repossession notices would start arriving soon. After that, foreclosure on the property itself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could rebuild any engine, diagnose any mechanical problem, repair things other mechanics gave up on. But she couldn't fix the fundamental problem: there weren't enough customers anymore to keep the doors open. The deadbeat in his excuses. The bell above the office door chimed, a sound that used to bring anticipation, now just brought anxiety about whether this was another customer she'd have to turn away because they couldn't pay. Victor Brennan shuffled in, looking like a man heading to his own execution. Mid-40s, weathered face, hands that showed a lifetime of ranch work. He'd been coming to Kellerman since Malcolm was alive, always paid on time, always appreciative of good work. Until 3 months ago, when his 2004 Dodge Ram needed a complete transmission rebuild. "Roz," he started, and she could hear the same excuse forming before he even finished inhaling. "I know what you're gonna say. Victor, it's been 12 weeks. Roz kept her voice level, professional, though frustration simmered beneath. 12 weeks since you drove out of here with a transmission that should last another 100,000 miles. That's a $4,200 job that I did on your word that you'd pay within 30 days. I know. Victor twisted his worn baseball cap in his hands. The cattle market's been brutal this year. We had that drought through summer, lost half our calves, and the bank's been on me about the ranch loan. Victor. Roz cut him off, not unkindly. Everyone's struggling. I get it. I'm struggling too. But I can't pay my bills with promises and hard luck stories. I've got suppliers who want their money, a bank that's about to repossess my equipment, and employees. She gestured toward the main bay where her only remaining mechanic, Danny Ortiz, was working on an oil change, who need their paychecks. She had to let go of 2 mechanics in the past year. Danny was hanging on out of loyalty more than good business sense. The kid was 24 and talented, but he could make more money at the tire shop in Hamilton. He stayed because Malcolm had given him his first real job, and because Roz had taught him everything her father had taught her. Victor's face sagged with genuine misery. He wasn't a deadbeat by nature, just another casualty of an economy that had left rural Montana behind. What if? Victor paused, clearly hating what he was about to propose. What if I gave you something as collateral? Just until I can get you the actual cash. Roz had heard variations of this offer before. Usually it was junk, a broken ATV someone swore was almost fixed, a vintage snowmobile that hadn't run since Reagan was president, tools that belonged in a museum rather than a working garage. What kind of something? She asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of her voice. There's an old pickup truck that's been sitting on my property for probably 35 years. A 1967 Ford F-250, the big one with the long bed. Used to belong to my uncle, Silas Brennan. When he died back in '89, it came to me along with the ranch. Thing doesn't run, hasn't in decades, but it's all there. Complete. Those old Fords, they're classics now, right? Collectors pay good money for them? Roz leaned back against her father's desk, considering. A '67 Ford F-250 in any condition might be worth something. If the body wasn't completely rotted out, if the frame was solid, if major components were intact, she might be able to part it out for a few $100s. Maybe if she got lucky and the truck was in decent shape, she could restore and flip it for a couple thousand. It wasn't $4,200, but it was something. And something was infinitely better than the nothing she currently had. I want to see it first, she said. If the truck's too far gone, this doesn't work. Victor's relief was immediate and visible. Yeah, absolutely. When can you come out? Tomorrow morning. First light. And Victor? She fixed him with a serious look. If this truck is junk, we're going to have to work out a real payment plan. I can't keep floating you. I understand. Thanks, Roz. Really? Your dad would have done the same thing. After Victor left, Roz stood in the quiet office, wondering if she'd just made a smart business decision or simply delayed the inevitable. Her father would have taken the truck, given Victor a chance. Malcolm Kellerman had believed in second chances, in treating people with dignity even when they couldn't pay. But Malcolm had died before the bypass killed the town. He'd never had to make the calculations Roz now faced daily, which bills to pay, which to delay, how long she could keep the lights on before everything her father built collapsed into bankruptcy. She looked at the photographs on the wall. Malcolm grinning beside a perfectly restored 1972 Chevy pickup, covered in dust and glory. In the photo, Roz was maybe 14, already nearly as tall as her father, holding a wrench and wearing the same proud smile. "Hope I'm making you proud, Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "Because I honestly don't know what I'm doing anymore." The forgotten machine. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of Montana November day where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. Roz followed Victor's beat-up ranch truck down a gravel road that wound through the Brennan property, 20 miles north of Millbrook Ridge. The landscape was classic Montana high country, rolling hills covered in dry grass, stands of ponderosa pine, and the Bitterroot Mountains rising like a wall to the west. Beautiful and harsh in equal measure. The kind of country that either made you stronger or broke you completely. They passed cattle pens in various states of disrepair, a barn with a roof that sagged dramatically in the middle, and farm equipment slowly being consumed by rust and weather. The Brennan Ranch had clearly seen better days, one more family operation struggling to survive in an era of corporate agriculture and thin margins. Victor's truck stopped beside a collapsed outbuilding that might have been a machine shed once. "It's back here," he called, climbing out. "Behind this old structure. I haven't actually looked at it in maybe 5 years. Used to park equipment around it to keep it out of sight." They picked their way through tall grass and scattered junk, rotted lumber, rusted barrels, an ancient hay baler that looked like it hadn't moved since the Ford administration. And then Roz saw it. The truck sat in a small clearing, partially hidden by volunteer aspens and 30-some years of accumulated debris. Even under the dust, rust, and bird droppings, Roz could see the classic lines of a '67 Ford F-250. The long bed. The substantial chrome bumper, now oxidized and pitted but still intact. Tall cab. Those distinctive round headlights. "Holy hell," Roz breathed, walking slowly around the vehicle. The truck had clearly been red once, a proper fire engine red, though now the paint was faded, peeling, and covered in patines of rust. The tires were flat and rotted, barely more than rubber husks around rusted rims. The glass was intact though, all windows present, even if the windshield had a spiderweb crack across the passenger side. "My Uncle Silas bought it new in April of '67, Victor explained, watching Roz circle the truck with professional scrutiny. "I remember hearing the story. He'd saved up for years, special ordered it with the big 390 V8 engine, the heavy-duty suspension. He was so proud of this truck. Drove it everywhere for maybe a year and a half. And then?" Roz prompted, running her hand along the bed rail. "Then he just stopped. Parked it here one day, this would have been maybe fall of '68, winter of '69, and never touched it again. Wouldn't talk about it. I asked him once when I was maybe 10 years old, just curious why this nice truck was rotting behind the barn. He got really angry. Like, scary angry. Told me to never ask about the truck again, never mention it, to forget it existed." Roz processed this information while examining the truck more closely. The body had rust, but not as badly as she'd feared. Montana's dry climate had actually preserved it better than if it had been sitting in a humid environment. The frame would need close inspection, but from what she could see, it appeared surprisingly solid. She tried the driver's door. Surprisingly, it wasn't locked. The hinges groaned in protest but the door opened, releasing a wave of musty, long-trapped air. The interior took Roz's breath away. Apart from thick dust and some fading, it was remarkably intact. The bench seat, original vinyl in red and white, was cracked but not torn apart. The dashboard, steering wheel, even the old AM radio, all still there. Original floor mats. The headliner sagged but hadn't disintegrated. This truck hadn't just been parked and forgotten. It had been preserved, protected from the elements despite sitting outside for decades. Roz slid into the driver's seat, her mechanic's mind already cataloging what she was seeing. She pulled the hood release, amazingly, it still worked. She got out and lifted the hood. The 390 cubic inch V8 engine sat there like a patient waiting for a doctor. Covered in dust and grime, yes, but all the major components were present. Air cleaner. Carburetor. Valve covers. Belts were cracked and would need replacement. Hoses were hardened. But the block itself appeared intact, no obvious cracks or damage. "You want it or not?" Victor asked nervously. "I know it's rough, but—" "I'll take it," Roz said immediately. "But you're paying for the tow to get it back to my shop." "And Victor? You're signing over the title right now. This becomes mine completely. We're square on the transmission work." Victor nodded emphatically. "Yeah, absolutely. I've got the title and the truck. Uncle Silas signed it over to me when he died, but I never transferred it. You can handle all that." As Victor jogged back to his truck to retrieve the paperwork, Roz stood looking at the '67 Ford. $4,200 of debt, gone in exchange for a truck that would need hundreds of hours of work and might be worth a few thousand at best if she could restore it. But something about this truck called to her. Maybe it was the mystery of why Silas Brennan had hidden it. Maybe it was the surprising preservation after so many years of abandonment. Maybe it was just the romantic notion of bringing something beautiful back from the edge of extinction. Or maybe, Roz thought, it was because she saw herself in this truck. Something valuable, something with potential, slowly rusting away because circumstances beyond its control had left it stranded and forgotten. "I'll get you running again," she promised the Ford quietly. "Whatever your story is, we're going to figure it out together." The first mystery. 3 days later, the Ford F-250 sat in Kellerman's main garage bay, looking simultaneously worse and better under fluorescent lights. Worse because the lighting revealed every rust pit, every cracked seal, every component that would need attention. Better because Roz could now see that the truck was fundamentally sound, a solid foundation hiding under decades of neglect. She'd planned to do a quick assessment, pull any obviously valuable parts, maybe clean it up and flip it to a collector who specialized in restoration projects. A week of work maximum, then move on to paying jobs. But the truck wouldn't let her work that fast. The more she examined it, the more questions emerged. The odometer read 4,847 miles. For a truck that Victor claimed had been driven for over a year, that number was impossible. Either someone had rolled back the odometer, or this truck had barely been used before being hidden away. Given the condition of the interior, seats that looked barely sat in, pedals with minimal wear, a steering wheel that still had texture on the grip, Roz believed the mileage was original. Which meant Silas Brennan had bought this truck new, driven it for maybe 6 months maximum, then parked it and forbade anyone from even mentioning it for the rest of his life. Why? Roz's father had taught her that every vehicle tells a story. Where patterns reveal how it was driven, modifications show what the owner valued. Even the junk left behind in the cab or bed provides clues about who drove it and for what purpose. This truck story made no sense. She started with the cab interior, carefully removing decades of accumulated dust. Under the bench seat she found nothing but mouse droppings and ancient dirt. The door pockets were empty. Even the ashtray, which often collected coins and receipts, was clean. The glove compartment, however, was a different story. Roz opened the metal door carefully, the spring mechanism still worked, and found herself looking at contents that appeared untouched since the late 1960s. The original owner's manual, still in its factory plastic sleeve. The registration card, filled out in careful handwriting, Silas Brennan, Route 3 Box 47, Millbrook Ridge, Montana. Purchased April 15, 1967. Behind the registration, she found something more interesting, a small notebook, the kind with a black cover and pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, and her breath caught. The notebook contained what appeared to be a simple log. Dates, locations, times. Most entries were mundane: town, groceries, 32 miles, or Henderson Ranch, delivered fencing, 18 miles. But starting in July 1968, the entries changed character. Night run to Old Quarry. Alone. No questions. Met W. at closed mine number 3. Discussed situation. Dangerous. Another delivery. This has to stop. People are dying. W. Says he has proof. Needs someone he can trust. The entries ended abruptly in September 1968. The rest of the notebook's pages were blank. Ross flipped back through the pages, her mind racing. Who is W? What deliveries? What mine? And most disturbingly, what did "people are dying" mean? She set the notebook aside and continued searching. At the very back of the glove compartment, wedged into a corner, she found a business card so old the paper had become brittle and yellowed. The card read: Whitmore T. Sterling. Sterling Mining and Excavation. Building Montana's prosperity since 1954. There was an address in Millbrook Ridge, though Ross knew the building had been torn down years ago. On the back of the card, written in faded blue ink that matched the handwriting in the notebook, was a message. Midnight. Old Sterling Claim, North Ridge. Come alone. Bring nothing. Tell nobody. Lives depend on silence. SB. Ross held the card carefully, afraid it might crumble. Sterling Mining had been one of the major employers in the region back in the 1950s through the 1980s. They'd primarily mined copper and some silver, with a few experimental uranium operations during the Cold War boom. Whitmore Sterling had been the owner, old Montana money, the kind of family that owned half a county and had political connections reaching all the way to Washington, D.C. But what would Silas Brennan, a ranch hand who'd saved for years to buy this truck, have to do with Whitmore Sterling? And why the secrecy, the midnight meetings, the warnings about lives depending on silence? Ross photographed the business card and the notebook pages with her phone, careful to capture every detail. She had a bad feeling about this, the kind of instinct her father had taught her to trust. When something doesn't add up, when the evidence contradicts the official story, when people hide things for decades, there's usually a reason. And that reason usually involves someone who doesn't want the truth discovered. The decision point. That evening, Ross sat in her small apartment above the garage, a converted office space her father had built when she'd returned to Millbrook Ridge after dropping out of trade school. The apartment was simple: a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and walls covered with Automotive posters and her father's old tools mounted as decoration. She'd laid out everything she'd found in the truck, the notebook, the business card, printed screenshots she'd taken. On her laptop, she had multiple browser tabs open, trying to research the history of Sterling Mining, Whitmore Sterling himself, and any connection to Silas Brennan. The smart play was obvious. Restore the truck mechanically, get it running, sell it to a collector or vintage truck enthusiast, and move on. She had enough real problems without chasing 50-year-old mysteries about dead men and defunct mining companies. But Ross couldn't let it go. Maybe it was her father's voice in her head, the one that said when something doesn't make sense, you've got a responsibility to figure out why. Maybe it was the simple fact that someone had hidden this truck for decades, had forbidden even talking about it, had taken their secrets to the grave. Or maybe it was something in those notebook entries. People are dying. Dangerous. Proof. What proof? Of what? Ross picked up her phone and called Danny Ortiz. He answered on the second ring. Boss? Everything okay? Danny, what do you know about Sterling Mining? Your grandfather worked there, right? There was a pause. Yeah, he did. 30-some years before the main operations shut down in '87. Why? Just curious about local history. I'm working on that old Ford from the Brennan place. Found some stuff in the cab that mentioned Sterling Mining. Got me wondering. Another pause, longer this time. My grandfather doesn't talk about his time there much. Says some of what they did, especially in the early days, wasn't exactly safe or legal. But that was a long time ago. What kind of stuff did you find? Ross considered how much to share. Nothing specific. Just references to meetings, some cryptic notes. Probably nothing important. Ross. Danny's voice carried a warning tone she'd never heard from him before. The Sterling family still has a lot of power around here. Whitmore Sterling's grandson, Marcus Sterling, basically owns half the county now. He's on the board of supervisors, controls a bunch of land and businesses. If you found something from back in the day that makes the family look bad, you might want to be careful about digging. Careful how? Careful like remembering that your garage is already in trouble. Careful like remembering that powerful families don't get powerful by letting people dig up their dirty laundry. My grandfather says that back in the day, people who asked too many questions about sterling mining had a way of getting encouraged to ask those questions somewhere else. If you know what I mean. Roz did know what he meant. It was a variation of the same story that played out in 1,000 small towns, the wealthy family, the company that employed everyone, the understanding that certain things weren't discussed because prosperity depended on selective memory. Thanks for the heads up, Danny. I'm probably just reading too much into old papers. Happens when you spend too much time alone with a truck. After hanging up, Roz sat staring at the business card and notebook. Every rational part of her brain said to leave it alone. Focus on survival, on saving the garage, on not antagonizing powerful families when she could barely make loan payments. But there was another voice, quieter, but persistent. The voice that said someone had gone to great lengths to hide this truck and its contents. Someone had kept secrets for 50 years. And those notebook entries weren't metaphorical. People are dying meant something specific. Roz made her decision. Tomorrow, she'd start restoration work on the truck. That was the cover story, the reasonable explanation for why she was spending time on a project that didn't immediately generate revenue. But while she worked, she'd also dig into the history. Carefully. Quietly. If there was nothing there, fine. She'd have a restored classic truck to sell. But if there was something there, if Silas Brennan and Whitmore Sterling had been involved in something dangerous enough to hide for half a century, then maybe that was a truth worth uncovering. Even if it made powerful people uncomfortable. Especially if it made powerful people uncomfortable. Roz looked at the photograph of her father on the small table beside her bed. Malcolm grinning, grease-covered, proud of a job well done. We don't quit on machines. And we don't quit on people, she quoted her father's words aloud. I'm adding one more to that list, Dad. We don't quit on the truth, either. Outside, the November wind rattled the apartment windows. Winter was coming to Montana. And Roz Kellerman had just committed herself to a restoration project that would turn out to be far more than simply rebuilding an engine. She'd committed to rebuilding truth itself, bolt by bolt, secret by secret. No matter who wanted it to stay buried. The restoration begins. The first week of working on the 1967 Ford F-250 followed a familiar rhythm for Roz. She'd done dozens of restoration projects over the years, some for customers, others for herself when time and money allowed. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a machine everyone else had given up on and bringing it back to life. Her father had called it mechanical resurrection, and he'd taught her that patience was just as important as skill. She started with the basics. Documentation. Before turning a single bolt, Roz photographed the truck from every angle, inside and out, top to bottom. She created a detailed condition report, noting every rust spot, every crack, every component that would need attention. This wasn't just good practice, it was her father's first rule of restoration: know what you're starting with so you can measure what you've accomplished. The engine bay received particular attention. The 390 cubic inch V8 was a beast of an engine, known for reliability and power. Ford had built these to last, and even after sitting dormant for over 3 decades, the major components appeared surprisingly sound. The valve covers were pitted with surface rust but intact. The carburetor would need a complete rebuild. Every rubber component, hoses, belts, gaskets, would need replacement. But the block itself showed no obvious cracks or damage. Danny Ortiz wandered over from the other bay where he'd been working on a routine brake job for Mrs. Henderson's Subaru. He let out a low whistle as he examined the Ford. "Man, this thing is cleaner than I expected," he said, running his hand along the fender. "Brennan's uncle must have really babied it before he parked it." "Or he parked it before anything could go wrong with it," Roz replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "Look at the odometer. Less than 5,000 miles. Danny leaned into the cab to check. No way. That can't be original. I think it is. Look at the seat wear, the pedals, the steering wheel. This truck barely got used before it was hidden. That's weird, right? Why buy a brand new truck and then barely drive it? Roz thought about the notebook and the business card she'd locked in her office safe. Maybe something happened that made him not want to drive it anymore. Over the next 3 days, Roz methodically disassembled the engine's ancillary systems. The air cleaner came off, revealing a carburetor caked with varnish from decades-old gasoline. She removed it carefully, setting it aside for a complete rebuild. The distributor cap was cracked and would need replacement. Spark plug wires were brittle and crumbling. But as she worked, her mind kept returning to those notebook entries and that cryptic business card. People are dying. What did that mean? Mining accidents? Something else? During her lunch break on Thursday, Roz walked down Main Street to the Millbrook Ridge Public Library. The building was a beautiful old Carnegie library from 1912, all red brick and tall windows, maintained by a dedicated staff of volunteers after the county had cut funding 5 years ago. Martha Sinclair, the head librarian who'd been there since Roz was in elementary school, looked up from her desk with genuine pleasure. Roz Kellerman. I haven't seen you in months. How's the garage? Hanging in there, Martha. I'm actually here doing some research. Do you have archived newspapers from the late 1960s? Martha's eyes lit up. She loved when people actually used the library's historical resources. We do. We've got the Millbrook Ridge Gazette going back to 1908, mostly on microfilm. What years are you interested in? 1967 through 1969, specifically. Anything related to Sterling mining. Something flickered across Martha's face. Was it concern? Caution? But it passed quickly, replaced by her professional librarian demeanor. Sterling mining. That takes me back. My father worked there in the 1970s. Let me get you set up with the microfilm reader. 15 minutes later, Roz was scrolling through digitized pages of the Millbrook Ridge Gazette from 1967. The small-town newspaper was a time capsule, advertisements for businesses that no longer existed, social announcements, local sports scores, and occasional news about Sterling Mining's operations. She found the first interesting article in August 1967. Sterling Mining expands operations. New uranium extraction process shows promise. Sterling Mining and Excavation announced yesterday the expansion of their uranium extraction operations in the Northern Ridge area. Company President Whitmore T. Sterling stated that new processing techniques developed in partnership with federal energy researchers could significantly increase yield from the company's existing claims. This represents the future of Montana's mining industry, Sterling told the Gazette. We're not just extracting minerals, we're participating in America's energy independence and national security. The expansion will add approximately 50 jobs to the region and includes construction of new processing facilities at the Sterling Claim site, 18 miles north of town. Roz made a note of the date and location. Northern Ridge area. That matched the notation on the business card Silas Brennan had kept, Old Sterling Claim, North Ridge. She continued scrolling through 1967 and into early 1968. More articles about Sterling Mining's success, about Whitmore Sterling being honored by the Montana Mining Association, about record profits and expansion. Then, in June 1968, the tone changed. Questions raised about mining safety. Anonymous source claims inadequate protections. County health officials are investigating claims that some mining operations in the region may not be following proper safety protocols for uranium extraction and processing. The concerns, raised by an anonymous source, center on potential contamination of groundwater and inadequate protective equipment for workers handling radioactive materials. Sterling Mining President Whitmore T. Sterling dismissed the claims as unfounded rumors spread by competitors and stated that his company exceeds all federal safety requirements. County Health Director Bernard Kowalski said his office would conduct inspections but noted that mining operations are primarily regulated at the federal level. Roz felt her pulse quicken. June 1968, right around when Silas Brennan's notebook entries started becoming cryptic and concerned. She took photos of the article with her phone and continued searching. July 1968. Local ranch hand missing family seeks information on Thomas Greer. The family of Thomas Greer, 34, is asking anyone with information about his whereabouts to contact the sheriff's department. Greer, a ranch hand employed at the Mackenzie Ranch, was last seen on July 3 leaving a local establishment in the evening. Sheriff Harold Finch said there are no signs of foul play but noted that Greer's truck was found abandoned near old logging roads in the Northern Ridge area. It's possible he got lost or injured hiking, Sheriff Finch said. We've organized search parties and are doing everything we can. Northern Ridge area again. Near the Sterling mining operations. Roz's unease grew. August 1968. Second worker missing Sterling mining employee fails to return from shift. Concern is mounting after a second man went missing in the Northern Ridge area in as many months. Robert Chen, 29, an employee of Sterling Mining and Excavation, did not return home after his shift on August 12. His vehicle was found near the mine site, keys still in the ignition. Company spokesman Lauren Stern stated that Chen had finished his shift normally and was last seen by coworkers leaving the facility. "This is very troubling," Stern said. "We're cooperating fully with the Sheriff's Department investigation." Sheriff Finch said the two disappearances may be unrelated, noting that the Northern Ridge area includes miles of remote terrain where accidents can occur. Robert Chen. Roz stared at the name. Danny's last name was Ortiz, but his mother's maiden name was Chen. Could this be a relative? She continued reading, her sense of dread building. September 1968 brought more troubling news. Federal inspectors visit Sterling Operations Company denies safety violations. Federal mining safety inspectors conducted a surprise inspection of Sterling mining and excavation facilities this week, following concerns raised by anonymous sources about potential safety violations and environmental contamination. The inspection focused on uranium processing operations and waste disposal procedures. Results have not been released, pending a full report from the federal agency. Whitmore T. Sterling issued a statement defending his company's practices. Sterling Mining has always operated with the highest standards of safety and environmental responsibility. These inspections will prove that we have nothing to hide. These inspections will prove we have nothing to hide. Roz thought about Silas Brennan's notebook entry. W. says he has proof. Needs someone he can trust. Proof of what? Safety violations? Something worse? The last relevant article she found was from October 1968. Questions persist about Northern Ridge disappearances. 3 men missing in 4 months. A third man has gone missing in the Northern Ridge area, intensifying concerns about safety in the remote region. David Brennan, 31, a ranch hand, was reported missing October 8 after failing to return from what family members said was a personal errand. Brennan's truck was found near the closed Sterling claim site, a location that has now been associated with all 3 disappearances over the past 4 months. Sheriff Finch said search efforts have been extensive but have yielded no clues to the men's whereabouts. "We're dealing with thousands of acres of rough terrain, abandoned mine shafts, and challenging conditions," the sheriff stated. When asked if the disappearances might be connected to recent controversies about mining operations, Sheriff Finch said, "We're exploring all possibilities, but right now we have no evidence of criminal activity." David Brennan. Roz's hands shook slightly as she photographed the article. Silas Brennan's brother? It had to be. The family connection, the timing, the location, it all fit. But the newspaper archives ended there. No resolution to the disappearances. No results from the federal inspection. No further articles about safety concerns at Sterling Mining. It was as if someone had drawn a curtain over the story, and the town had collectively agreed to stop looking behind it. The warning. Roz was so absorbed in the microfilm archives that she didn't notice Martha Sinclair approaching until the librarian spoke quietly from just behind her. "Find what you were looking for?" Roz jumped slightly, then nodded. Yeah, actually. More than I expected. Martha, what happened with these disappearances? I don't remember ever hearing about this. Martha pulled up a chair and sat down, her expression troubled. You wouldn't have. It was before you were born, and by the time you were old enough to hear town history, people had stopped talking about it. The official story is that 3 men had accidents in rough country over a few months in 1968. Tragic coincidence. And the unofficial story? Martha glanced around the empty library before continuing. The unofficial story is that those men knew something about what Sterling Mining was doing in those northern hills. Something bad enough that people started disappearing after they started asking questions. What kind of something? I don't know specifics. I was just a girl then. But my father. Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. My father worked at Sterling Mining for 25 years. He never talked about those months in 1968, but I remember him being scared. Really scared. We almost moved away. My mother wanted to leave Millbrook Ridge entirely. But they had 3 kids, no savings, and Dad's entire career was mining. Where would we go? Did your father know the men who disappeared? He knew David Brennan a little. Said David had been doing some kind of work for Whitmore Sterling, something off the books. Then David started asking uncomfortable questions, and Martha made a gesture like something vanishing into thin air. My father told me once, years later when I was in college, that there were things buried in those hills. Not just ore and minerals. Secrets. Evidence. Maybe bodies. The bluntness of that last word hung in the air between them. Martha, why are you telling me this? The librarian fixed Roz with a serious look. Because I saw what articles you were reading, and I recognized that look on your face. It's the same look my father had when he was trying to decide whether to speak up or keep his head down. He chose to keep his head down, and I think it haunted him for the rest of his life. But Roz, you need to understand something. The Sterling family still runs this county. Marcus Sterling, Whitmore's grandson, he's on the county board, he owns properties all over the region, he has connections to state politics. If you start digging into things his grandfather wanted buried, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Martha stood up, smoothing her skirt. The kind where permits get delayed, inspections become very thorough, loans get called in early. The kind where your business gets squeezed until you decide it's not worth the trouble. The Sterling family doesn't make people disappear anymore, Roz. They don't have to. They can destroy you perfectly legally. After Martha walked away, Roz sat in the quiet library, staring at the microfilm reader. She thought about her garage, already teetering on financial collapse. She thought about the loan payments she couldn't make, the equipment that might get repossessed, the legacy her father had left her that she was desperate to preserve. Getting on the bad side of the most powerful family in the county would be stupid. Suicidal, even. But 3 men had disappeared. People had died. And someone, probably Silas Brennan, had kept evidence hidden in a truck for 50 years because he'd been too afraid to come forward while alive. Roz gathered her notes and photographs and left the library. Outside, the November afternoon had turned gray and cold. Snow would come soon, and with it the quietest months of the year. Fewer customers, less work, more time alone with her thoughts in that Ford F-250 sitting in her garage bay. More time to decide whether she was the kind of person who looked away from uncomfortable truths, or the kind who couldn't help but dig until she found them. The midnight visitor. That night, Roz worked late in the garage, ostensibly cleaning and organizing parts for the Ford's restoration. In reality, she was thinking through what she'd learned at the library, trying to make sense of a 50-year-old puzzle with too many missing pieces. She was under the truck, examining the frame for rust damage, when she heard the small office bell chime. Someone had entered through the front door. Roz rolled out from under the truck and checked her watch. 10:47 p.m. The garage had been closed for hours. She always locked the front door when working late, specifically to avoid situations like this. "We're closed," she called out, grabbing a large wrench, more as psychological comfort than actual weapon. "Come back during business hours." A figure appeared in the doorway between the office and the main garage bay. An elderly man, probably in his 80s, leaning heavily on a cane. He was well-dressed, expensive jacket, polished shoes, the kind of clothing that spoke of serious money. His face was gaunt, skin almost translucent, eyes sunken but sharp and alert. "I know you're closed, Miss Kellerman," the old man said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his frail appearance. "I apologize for the intrusion. But I saw the lights on, and I'm afraid I don't have time for business hours anymore." Something in his tone, a mixture of urgency and resignation, made Ross set down the wrench. "How did you get in?" "I locked that door." "I've been picking locks since before your parents were born, young lady. One develops useful skills when one has lived the kind of life I have." He moved slowly into the garage bay, his cane tapping on the concrete. His gaze fixed on the Ford F-250. "So it's true. Silas Brennan's truck. After all these years." Ross felt her heartbeat accelerate. "Who are you?" The old man turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes, pain, regret, perhaps relief. "My name is Whitmore Sterling. And I believe you found my business card in that truck." The confession begins. For a moment, Ross couldn't speak. Whitmore Sterling. The man from the business card, from the newspaper articles, from 50 years of buried history. She'd assumed he was dead. The articles had made him seem old even in 1968. That's impossible. You'd have to be 93 years old, Sterling finished for her. "I was 43 in 1968. And I've spent every one of those 50-some years since then trying to decide whether to take my secrets to the grave or find someone brave enough to hear them." He gestured toward her small office. "May we sit? I'm afraid I tire easily these days. Cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me weeks, maybe a month. Which is why I'm here tonight." Ross led him to the office, her mind racing. She offered him her father's old desk chair, the most comfortable seat in the place, and perched on the edge of the desk herself, watching this ghost from Montana's past settle in with visible relief. "How did you know I had the truck?" she asked. Sterling smiled faintly. "Small towns have long memories and loose lips. Victor Brennan sold a truck to the mechanic lady. The truck that used to belong to his uncle Silas. The truck that Silas swore to me he would never let anyone see, never let anyone examine, because of what it contained." He paused. "I've been waiting for this truck to resurface for 50 years. Part of me hoped it never would. Part of me prayed it would." "The business card," Ross said. "The notebook. You met with Silas Brennan in 1968. "I did. Multiple times. Silas was a good man, Miss Kellerman. Honest. Brave. Smarter than most people gave him credit for. He worked as a ranch hand, but he'd been a combat engineer in Korea. Knew his way around machinery, understood structures and systems." Sterling's eyes grew distant. "He was also my brother-in-law, though that's not widely known. He married my younger sister Catherine in 1966. She died in childbirth in 1967. Their daughter died too." This new information rearranged everything Ross thought she knew. So when David Brennan disappeared. David was Silas's younger brother. My wife's other brother-in-law. And yes, his disappearance is connected to everything else. Sterling leaned forward, his hands clasped on the cane. "Miss Kellerman, what I'm about to tell you could destroy my family's reputation and reveal crimes that were never prosecuted. I'm telling you anyway because I'm dying, and I've decided that taking these secrets to hell with me would be cowardice. I've been a coward long enough." Ross pulled out her phone. "Do you mind if I record this? I insist on it. What good is a confession without a witness?" She started the recording and set the phone between them. "Tell me what happened in 1968. Sterling took a deep breath, and when he spoke, it was with the weariness of a man who'd carried a terrible weight for half a century. In 1967, Sterling Mining began a new uranium extraction operation in the Northern Hills. The federal government was pushing hard for domestic uranium production, Cold War paranoia, the arms race, all of that. They offered lucrative contracts to companies that could increase output. I'd developed a new processing technique that could extract more uranium from lower-grade ore. It was efficient, profitable, and completely illegal under environmental regulations. But federal inspectors were easy to avoid back then if you had connections and money. I had both. He paused, closing his eyes briefly. The problem was the waste. Conventional uranium processing produces tailings, radioactive waste that has to be contained properly. My process produced far more waste and at higher contamination levels. Disposing of it properly would have cost millions and destroyed our profit margins. So you dumped it, Ross said quietly. We dumped it. In abandoned mine shafts, in natural depressions that we covered with dirt, in areas where we calculated no one would look for decades. I told myself it was contained, that the remote location meant no risk to population centers. I was lying to myself. Sterling opened his eyes and looked directly at Ross. In spring of 1968, Thomas Greer, the first man who disappeared, was a ranch hand who supplemented his income doing odd jobs. He did some work for us, moving materials. He noticed things. Barrels being buried in places they shouldn't be. Soil that had a strange consistency and color near our disposal sites. He started asking questions. What happened to him? My foreman, a man named Luther Hask, decided Thomas knew too much. Hask was former military, the kind of man who saw problems as things to be eliminated. I didn't know about it until afterward, but he... Sterling's voice caught. He made Thomas disappear. Made it look like a hiking accident in rough country. The office was completely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the recording device capturing every word. When Robertson started noticing discrepancies in shipment records and asking about missing inventory, Hask solved that problem the same way. And when David Brennan, Silas's own brother, started piecing together what was really happening in those northern hills, Hask dealt with him too. You're saying your foreman murdered 3 men to cover up illegal waste dumping, Ross said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was hearing. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying that I knew about it. Maybe not before the first murder, but certainly after. Hask came to me and told me what he'd done, told me it was necessary to protect the company, to protect my family's fortune. And I... Sterling's face twisted with anguish. I did nothing. I let it stand. I paid Hask extra and sent him away to work at our operations in Nevada. I buried the evidence and I kept running the business. What about Silas Brennan? Where does he fit in? Silas was devastated by his brother's disappearance. He knew David had been doing some kind of investigation, that he'd been asking questions about Sterling Mining. So Silas started his own investigation. He was methodical about it. He'd drive that truck, the one sitting in your garage right now, up to the northern hills at night. He'd watch our operations. Document things. He broke into our offices once and photographed records. Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small key. Eventually, Silas came to me directly. Told me he knew what was happening, knew about the illegal dumping, suspected what had happened to his brother. He said he had proof, documents and photographs he'd hidden somewhere safe. Why didn't he go to the authorities? Because I convinced him it wouldn't work. I had connections to the sheriff's office, to the state mining board, even to federal regulators. I showed Silas how deep the corruption went, how many people were on my family's payroll or owed us favors. I told him that if he came forward, he'd end up like his brother, another disappearance that no one would investigate too closely. You threatened him, Ross said, not bothering to hide her disgust. I did worse than threaten him. I appealed to his reason, his fear, his desire to survive. I made him see that exposing the truth would destroy him without actually achieving justice. And then I made him a deal. Sterling held up the key. Silas agreed to keep silent as long as I shut down the illegal dumping operations, which I did. And as long as I agreed that someday, when enough time had passed, the truth would come out. He kept his evidence, documents, photographs, soil samples, everything, hidden away. This key opens the storage container where he hid it all. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Because I'm dying, and I've decided that I don't want to meet my maker as a man who let murderers go unpunished and let toxic waste poison the land my family claimed to love. Because Silas Brennan kept his word for 50 years and took his silence to the grave, and I owe it to him to make sure his evidence finally sees the light. Sterling set the key on the desk between them. And because you found that truck, which means fate or fortune or divine justice has decided it's time for this story to be told. Roz picked up the key, feeling its weight. Where's the storage container? On the old Sterling claim property, Northern Ridge. There's a concrete bunker built into the hillside, looked like a mining equipment storage facility but was actually something I built in case I ever needed to hide sensitive materials. Silas used it for his evidence. This key opens it. And if I go up there and retrieve this evidence? What then? Sterling met her eyes steadily. Then you'll have proof of environmental crimes that have contaminated hundreds of acres of Montana land. You'll have evidence that 3 men were murdered to protect Sterling Mining's profits. You'll have documentation of a 50-year cover-up involving some of the most powerful families in the state. Your grandson, Roz said. Marcus Sterling. He's not going to let this come out quietly. Marcus doesn't know the full truth. He knows his grandfather's company did some questionable things, but he thinks it was just cutting corners on safety regulations, paying off a few inspectors. He doesn't know about the murders. He doesn't know about the extent of the contamination. If you bring this evidence forward, it will destroy what's left of my family's reputation and probably cost Marcus a substantial portion of his wealth and influence. Sterling stood slowly, using his cane for support. Which is why I'm doing this, Ms. Kellerman. Because my family's wealth was built on blood and poison, and I've decided that's not a legacy I want to leave behind. I'd rather be remembered as the man who finally told the truth than the man who took it to his grave. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. In that storage bunker, along with Silas's evidence, you'll find something else. An envelope addressed to you, well, addressed to whoever found the truck. It's my full written confession, witnessed and notarized 3 days ago. Everything I've told you tonight, in detail, in writing, legally documented. Why me? Roz asked. Why not take this to journalists or federal investigators yourself? Sterling smiled sadly. Because I'm 93 years old and dying of cancer. Because my testimony alone would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a senile old man or the revenge fantasy of someone bitter about his mortality. But physical evidence? Documents? Photographs? Soil samples that can still be tested for contamination? That's something real. Something that can't be dismissed. He reached the door and looked back at her one more time. Also, Ms. Kellerman, I chose you because Silas Brennan chose you. He could have destroyed that truck before he died. He could have burned the notebook, thrown away the business card, let the evidence disappear forever. But he didn't. He passed the truck to his nephew, and somehow, eventually, it ended up with you. A mechanic. Someone who would look closely at the vehicle, who would find the clues he left behind. Or maybe, Roz said quietly, he was just a man who couldn't bring himself to finish what he started. Perhaps. But now you can finish it for him. The question is, will you? After Sterling left, moving slowly down the dark street, a dying man walking away from the last chance to make amends, Roz sat alone in her office, holding a key that unlocked 50 years of buried truth. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. Roz didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment above the garage, the small brass key on the table in front of her, Whitmore Sterling's recorded confession playing through her headphones for the 3rd time. Each replay brought new details into focus, new implications she hadn't caught before. 3 men murdered. Hundreds of acres contaminated with radioactive waste. 50 years of silence bought with threats and money and the casual exercise of power by a family that controlled half the county. And now she held the key, literally and figuratively, to exposing it all. The smart decision was obvious: take the key, the recording, everything, to federal authorities. Environmental Protection Agency. FBI. Let people with resources and legal authority handle it. Stay out of the line of fire, protect her struggling business, avoid making enemies of the Sterling family. But Roz had learned long ago that the smart decision and the right decision weren't always the same thing. She thought about Silas Brennan, who'd kept evidence hidden for decades because he'd been convinced that speaking up would only get him killed without achieving justice. She thought about David Brennan and Thomas Greer and Robert Chen, 3 men who'd asked questions and paid with their lives. She thought about Whitmore Sterling, dying of cancer, who'd spent 50 years as a coward before finally finding courage in his last weeks of life. And she thought about her father, Malcolm Kellerman, who'd taught her that some things mattered more than profit or safety or playing it smart. We don't quit on machines, and we don't quit on people, he'd said. And we don't quit on what's right, even when it's hard. As dawn broke over Millbrook Ridge, painting the snowy mountains pink and gold, Roz made her decision. She would retrieve the evidence. She would document everything. And then she would make damn sure it got into the right hands, regardless of what it cost her. But she wouldn't be stupid about it. She'd do this carefully, methodically, with backup plans and insurance policies. Because exposing a 50-year-old conspiracy was one thing. Surviving the exposure was another. Friday morning, Roz opened the garage at the usual time, but her mind was already miles away, planning an expedition to the northern ridge. She needed to think through every detail, anticipate every problem. Danny arrived at 8, stomping snow off his boots and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street, their morning ritual when business was slow and they could afford a few minutes of peace before diving into work. "You look like hell," Danny observed, handing her one of the cups. "Rough night?" "Couldn't sleep. Been thinking about that Ford restoration, trying to figure out the best approach." The lie came easily, though it tasted bitter. Danny was a good kid, loyal and trustworthy. But involving him in this would put him at risk, and Roz wouldn't do that. "Speaking of that truck," Danny said, leaning against the workbench, "I talked to my grandfather last night. Asked him about Robert Chen, the guy who went missing from Sterling Mining in 1968. Roz's attention sharpened. "And?" "He was my great-uncle. My grandfather's younger brother." Danny's expression was complicated, curiosity mixed with old grief. "Grandpa doesn't talk about him much. Says Robert was smart, ambitious, wanted to move up from manual labor to management. He'd started noticing things at the mine that didn't add up. Shipments that went nowhere. Paperwork that didn't match reality. And then one day he just disappeared. Your grandfather never found out what happened. Official story was that Robert had an accident somewhere in the backcountry. His truck was found near the mine site, but they never found a body. Grandpa always suspected it was more than an accident, but what could he do? He had a family to feed, and Sterling Mining was the biggest employer around. You didn't ask uncomfortable questions if you wanted to keep your job." Danny stared into his coffee cup. "The thing is, Roz, when I mentioned I was working on Silas Brennan's old truck, Grandpa got really quiet. Then he said something weird. He said, if that truck still has what Silas said it did, you tell your boss to be very, very careful. The Sterling family doesn't forget, and they don't forgive." Roz felt cold despite the coffee warming her hands. "Your grandfather knew Silas Brennan?" "Apparently they worked together sometimes, doing contract labor for various ranches. After Robert disappeared, Silas told my grandfather that he was looking into things, that he thought he knew what really happened. Grandpa tried to talk him out of it, said it was suicide to cross Sterling Mining. Last conversation they had, Silas said he'd found proof but he was going to hide it somewhere safe until the time was right." "Did your grandfather know where?" Danny shook his head. "Silas never told anyone. Said it was safer that way. What people didn't know couldn't be beaten or threatened out of them. After Danny returned to work on a routine maintenance job, Roz went to her office and began systematic preparation. She pulled up topographical maps of the Northern Ridge area on her laptop, identifying possible routes to the old Sterling claim property. The mining roads wouldn't be maintained anymore, and November snow would make access challenging. She'd need her truck, the sturdy F-250 with four-wheel drive and snow tires. She'd need emergency supplies in case something went wrong and she got stranded in the backcountry. And she'd need a witness, someone who knew where she was going and could raise alarm if she didn't return. More importantly, she needed insurance. Some way to ensure that even if something happened to her, the evidence would still come to light. Roz spent the next hour uploading Sterling's recorded confession to 3 separate cloud storage accounts, emailing copies to herself through different services, and preparing a detailed document explaining everything she knew. She scheduled emails to be sent automatically to the EPA, FBI, and several investigative journalists if she didn't log in to cancel them within 48 hours. It was paranoid, maybe overly dramatic. But 3 men had died for asking questions about Sterling mining, and Roz wasn't going to be the 4th. The journey north. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold. Roz told Danny she was taking a personal day, doing some scouting for salvage opportunities in the backcountry, a plausible enough story that he wouldn't question it. She loaded her truck with emergency supplies, camera equipment, evidence collection materials, and the brass key Whitmore Sterling had given her. The drive north from Millbrook Ridge took her through increasingly remote territory. She passed the turnoff for the Brennan Ranch, then continued another 8 miles before finding the overgrown road that led toward the old Sterling mining claims. The road was barely visible under recent snow, more of a suggestion than an actual route. Roz engaged four-wheel drive and proceeded carefully, her truck climbing gradually into the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Pine forests pressed close on both sides, broken occasionally by clearings that offered stunning views of the valley below. After 40 minutes of slow, careful driving, she reached what appeared to be the end of the maintained road, or what had once been maintained, decades ago. A rusted gate with faded "No Trespassing" signs hung open, one hinge broken. Beyond it, the road deteriorated into a rough track barely wide enough for her truck. Roz continued another mile before the track became impassable. She parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The only sounds were wind through the pines and the ticking of her truck's cooling engine. She pulled out the crude map Whitmore Sterling had sketched on the back of an envelope, his handwriting shaky but legible. The storage bunker was supposed to be another half-mile northeast, built into a hillside overlooking one of the old mine entrances. Roz shouldered her backpack, checked her phone, no signal this far out, as expected, and started hiking. The landscape was beautiful and eerie in equal measure. This had once been an active industrial site, she could see the remnants of it everywhere. Rusted cable from old tramways hanging between trees. Collapsed timber structures that might have been ore processing facilities. The dark mouths of mine entrances, some barred with rusted metal grates, others just open wounds in the hillside. She found the first dump site after 20 minutes of walking. At first it just looked like a natural depression in the landscape, a place where the ground dipped between 2 ridges. But as Roz got closer, she noticed the ground had a strange texture, looser soil in an area that should have been solid. And the vegetation was wrong. Sparse and stunted, with an unhealthy yellowish tinge to what should have been green pine needles. She pulled out her Geiger counter, a purchase from last night at a hunting and surplus store, the clerk giving her curious looks but asking no questions. When she turned it on and swept it across the area, the clicks accelerated immediately. Not dangerously high, but definitely elevated above background radiation. Roz photographed everything. The depression, the stunted vegetation, the Geiger counter readings. Each photo was automatically backed up to cloud storage thanks to a satellite internet device she'd reluctantly purchased that morning, expensive, but necessary for this mission. She found 2 more dump sites as she continued toward the bunker location. Each showed the same pattern: disturbed earth, unhealthy plant growth, elevated radiation readings. Someone, Luther Hask and his crew, presumably, had simply buried barrels of radioactive waste in shallow pits, covered them with dirt, and walked away. 50 years of rain and snowmelt and freeze-thaw cycles had broken down whatever containers held the waste. The contamination was leaching into the soil, into the groundwater, spreading slowly but inevitably through the ecosystem. The bunker. Ross found the bunker exactly where Sterling's map indicated, built into a hillside, camouflaged with native rock facing and overgrown with brush. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it thinking it was just a natural rock formation. The door was heavy steel, locked with a mechanism that looked military surplus, the kind designed to keep out everyone except someone with the right key. Ross pulled out the brass key Sterling had given her, her hands shaking slightly with cold and adrenaline. The key fit perfectly. The lock mechanism was stiff from decades of disuse, but with some effort and lubricant from her backpack, she managed to turn it. The door swung open with a groan that echoed off the surrounding hills. Inside, the bunker was dark and smelled of concrete and long-trapped air. Ross pulled out her flashlight and stepped inside. The space was maybe 12 feet square, concrete walls and floor, a low ceiling that made her duck slightly. Along one wall were metal shelving units, and on those shelves sat the evidence Silas Brennan had risked his life to collect and preserve. Dozens of document boxes, each labeled in Silas's careful handwriting. Shipping records 1967-68. Waste disposal manifests, falsified. Photographs, illegal dump sites. Soil samples, contaminated areas. Personnel files, Sterling Mining. Ross set up a portable work light and began methodically photographing every box, every document, every piece of evidence. This would take hours, but she couldn't risk just grabbing everything and running. She needed to document it in place, create a record that showed this evidence had been hidden here for decades, untouched and preserved. In one box, she found photographs that made her stomach turn. Images of workers in inadequate protective gear handling materials that should have required full hazmat suits. Pictures of barrels being dumped into open pits. Photos of contaminated soil being spread across areas that were then covered with fresh dirt to hide the evidence. Another box contained personal journals, Silas Brennan's detailed observations from his surveillance of Sterling mining operations. Dates, times, vehicle license plates, names of workers involved in the dumping. It was meticulous, methodical, and damning. The most disturbing box was labeled simply David. Inside were David Brennan's personal effects, his wallet, his watch, his wedding ring. There was also a blood-stained shirt and a handwritten note in Silas's writing. Found these hidden in Luther Hask's truck, 3 days after David disappeared. Hask must have kept them as trophies or insurance. He didn't know I saw him hide them. I stole them back. This is proof of murder, but I'm too afraid to come forward. God forgive me for my cowardice. S.B. In Martha's living room, Ross found herself facing a small group of elderly residents. She recognized Danny's grandfather, Carlos Ortiz, looking older and more worn than the last time she'd seen him. There was also an elderly woman Martha introduced as Patricia Greer, Thomas Greer's sister. And a man in his 60s named James Brennan, Silas and David Brennan's nephew. "You found Uncle Silas's evidence," James Brennan said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ross nodded and began unpacking the materials she'd taken from the bunker, Sterling's confession, the photographs, the documents. She also showed them the photos and videos on her laptop of everything else that remained in the bunker. As they examined the evidence, 50 years of pain and unanswered questions played across the faces of these people who'd lost loved ones and never known why. "My brother didn't die in a hiking accident," Patricia Greer said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "He was murdered because he saw something he shouldn't have seen." Carlos Ortiz held up a photograph of his brother Robert. "I knew it. I always knew it. But nobody would listen, and I was too afraid to push too hard." "Why?" Ross asked. "Why was everyone so afraid?" "Because the Sterling family controlled everything," Martha explained. "Jobs, property, credit, political connections. Going against them meant losing your livelihood, losing your home, sometimes losing your family if you got them blacklisted too. It was easier to stay quiet, to tell yourself it was all probably just tragic accidents, than to fight a battle you knew you'd lose. But that was 50 years ago, Ross said. Things are different now. We have federal environmental agencies, we have investigative journalism, we have laws protecting whistleblowers. James Brennan shook his head. You think the Sterling family got less powerful over 50 years? Marcus Sterling sits on the county board, owns half the commercial property in 3 counties, and has political connections that reach all the way to the governor's office. Times change, but power doesn't disappear, it just evolves. Which is why you can't do this alone, Martha said firmly. If you try to expose this by yourself, you'll be dismissed as a troublemaker with a grudge, or worse, you'll end up like my father, so pressured and threatened that you back down just to survive. So what do we do? Roz asked. We do it together, Carlos said. You have the evidence. We have the family connections, the personal stories, the moral authority of being the victim's relatives. And we have numbers. There are dozens of families in this region affected by what Sterling Mining did. Some know it, some suspect it, but all of them deserve to hear the truth. Over the next 3 hours, they developed a plan. Roz would turn over copies of all evidence to federal authorities, the EPA for the environmental crimes, the FBI for the murders. But they would also go public simultaneously, holding a press conference with family members of the disappeared men, presenting the evidence to local and national media. Most importantly, they would file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all families affected by Sterling Mining's contamination, using the evidence to support claims for health damages, property devaluation, and wrongful death. The Sterling family will fight back, Martha warned. They'll use every legal trick, every political connection, every dollar they have to discredit you and bury this. Let them try, Ross said, feeling a strange calm settle over her. They've been burying this for 50 years. It's time to dig it back up. The confrontation comes early. That night, Roz returned to her apartment above the garage, exhausted but energized by the plan they'd developed. She'd made copies of the evidence, distributed them to multiple people, ensured that even if something happened to her, the truth would come out. She was uploading one final set of documents to a secure server when she heard footsteps on the external stairs leading to her apartment. Heavy footsteps, more than one person. Then came the knock. Firm, authoritative, the kind of knock that said the person on the other side wasn't going to leave without getting what they came for. Roz opened the door to find 2 men in expensive suits. One was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from golf courses and Caribbean vacations. The other was younger, maybe 40, with the build and bearing of someone who worked in personal security. Miss Kellerman, the older man said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into her apartment. My name is Marcus Sterling. I believe you've been trespassing on my family's property and stealing items that don't belong to you. Roz stood her ground. The property hasn't belonged to your family since the mining claims were abandoned in the 1980s. It's federal land now. And the items I collected are evidence of crimes committed by your grandfather's company. Marcus Sterling's smile was cold and predatory. I see my grandfather got to you before he died. The old fool. Weak and sentimental, trying to salve his conscience in his final days by spreading lies about the family business. They're not lies. I have documents, photographs, soil samples, and your grandfather's full confession. 3 men were murdered to cover up illegal radioactive waste dumping. The evidence is irrefutable. Evidence that you obtained through trespassing and theft, Sterling countered. Evidence that would be inadmissible in any court. Evidence that could land you in serious legal trouble if you try to use it. That's not how it works and you know it. I'm turning everything over to federal authorities. The EPA will test the contaminated sites. The FBI will investigate the murders. Your grandfather's written confession will. My grandfather was 93 years old and dying of cancer, Sterling interrupted. His mind was going. He was on heavy medications. Any confession he signed would be dismissed as the ravings of a senile old man trying to rewrite history to make himself feel better about his mortality. He moved closer to Roz, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "Here's what's going to happen, Ms. Kellerman. You're going to return everything you stole from that bunker. You're going to delete every photograph, every recording, every copy you've made. And then you're going to forget this ever happened. And if I don't? Then we'll make your life very difficult. Your garage is already failing, I've seen the financial records. The bank that holds your loan? My family has a controlling interest. One phone call and they'll foreclose immediately. The county inspector who signed off on your business license. He works for me. Another call and you'll face violations that will shut you down pending expensive remediation." Sterling smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll lose everything your father built, Ms. Kellerman. And for what? To expose crimes from 50 years ago that nobody cares about anymore? To destroy a family that employs hundreds of people and contributes millions to this region's economy? That's not justice, that's just vindictive destruction." Roz felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean. 3 men were murdered. The land was poisoned. Your family profited from crimes and covered them up for half a century. And you think nobody cares? I think most people care more about their jobs and their mortgages and their children's futures than they do about correcting historical injustices, Sterling replied. "I think you'll find that when you try to rally support for your crusade, most people in this town will choose the Sterling family over a mechanic with a failing business and a grudge." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You have 24 hours to make the right decision, Ms. Kellerman. After that, the consequences are on you." After they left, Roz sat in her apartment, shaking with anger and adrenaline. Marcus Sterling had just threatened everything she had left, her business, her father's legacy, her livelihood. He'd also just confirmed everything Whitmore Sterling had confessed. If there was nothing to hide, why threaten her? Why not let the authorities investigate and find nothing? Why come personally to intimidate her into silence? Roz pulled out her phone and called Martha Sinclair. "They came to my apartment. Marcus Sterling himself. He threatened to destroy my business if I don't hand over the evidence and keep quiet." "Did you record it?" Martha asked immediately. "Every word." Roz had turned on her phone's recording app the moment she'd heard footsteps on her stairs. He essentially admitted his family has something to hide and is willing to abuse their power to keep it hidden. "Good. That's more evidence." "Roz, are you scared?" "Terrified," Roz admitted. "But also angry. Really, really angry." "Good," Martha said again. "Fear without anger makes you run. Anger without fear makes you stupid. Both together makes you dangerous. We're moving up the timeline. Press conference tomorrow. Can you be ready?" Roz thought about her father, about his belief that some things mattered more than safety or profit. She thought about Silas Brennan, who'd kept evidence hidden for 50 years because he'd been too afraid to use it. She thought about 3 dead men who'd never gotten justice. "I'll be ready," she said. The Millbrook Ridge Community Center had never seen a gathering quite like this. By 9 a.m., the main hall was packed with over 200 people, local residents, regional journalists, federal investigators who'd arrived overnight after receiving Roz's evidence packages, and even a camera crew from a national news network that had caught wind of the story. Roz stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she organized her presentation materials. Beside her stood Martha Sinclair, Carlos Ortiz, Patricia Greer, and James Brennan, families of the disappeared, finally ready to speak after 50 years of silence. Danny had closed the garage for the day and sat in the front row, his grandfather beside him. The old man's face was set with grim determination, ready to hear the truth about his brother's fate after half a century of official lies. Through a gap in the curtain, Roz could see Marcus Sterling seated in the back row, flanked by expensive lawyers. He'd come to intimidate, to control the narrative, to minimize damage. But his presence only strengthened her resolve. At exactly 9:30, Martha stepped to the podium. The room fell silent. My name is Martha Sinclair, she began, her voice steady and clear. 50 years ago, my father worked at Sterling Mining and knew things that terrified him into silence for the rest of his life. Today, that silence ends. She introduced Roz, who approached the podium with a laptop and a thick folder of documents. The presentation screen behind her flickered to life. In November 1968, Roz began. 3 men disappeared within 4 months in the Northern Ridge area near Sterling mining operations. Thomas Greer, Robert Chen, and David Brennan. The official explanation was hiking accidents in rough terrain. The truth is that they were murdered to protect a massive criminal conspiracy involving illegal radioactive waste dumping and environmental contamination that continues to this day. The room erupted in murmurs. Roz displayed the first photograph, Whitmore Sterling's handwritten confession, every damning word visible on the screen. This is a signed, notarized confession from Whitmore T. Sterling, written 3 weeks before his death. In it, he admits to ordering illegal disposal of uranium processing waste, to covering up the murders of 3 men committed by his foreman Luther Hask, and to bribing officials to avoid federal investigation. She showed photograph after photograph, the dump sites with elevated radiation readings, the falsified shipping manifests, the images of workers handling radioactive materials without proper protection. Then came David Brennan's bloodstained shirt and personal effects, recovered by Silas Brennan and preserved as evidence. Patricia Greer stood to speak, her voice breaking with emotion. My brother Thomas was 24 years old when he died. He had a wife and a baby daughter. For 50 years, I believed he'd gotten lost and died of exposure. Now I know he was murdered for asking questions about barrels being buried in the hills. Carlos Ortiz followed. My brother Robert wanted to be an engineer. He was smart, ambitious. He noticed that shipping records didn't match what was actually leaving the mine site. He started asking where the missing materials were going. 3 weeks later, he disappeared. James Brennan's testimony was perhaps the most powerful. My uncle David spent months investigating his brother Silas's suspicions about Sterling Mining. He found proof of what they were doing. He was murdered for it. And my uncle Silas lived with that knowledge, too terrified to come forward, for the rest of his life. He left the evidence hidden, hoping someday someone would be brave enough to use it. When Roz displayed the video footage from her phone, left recording in the bunker, showing the extent of the evidence cache before Marcus Sterling's men had arrived, the room was completely silent. She played the audio recording of Marcus Sterling's threats to destroy her business if she didn't hand over the evidence and keep quiet. This is what power looks like when it's protecting something it can't afford to have exposed, Roz said quietly. Threats. Intimidation. The casual exercise of control over people's livelihoods and lives. An EPA investigator stood and identified himself. I can confirm that based on the evidence Ms. Kellerman provided, federal teams began testing the Northern Ridge sites yesterday evening. Preliminary results show radioactive contamination at levels that constitute a significant environmental hazard. We're expediting a full investigation. An FBI agent added, we're also reopening the cold cases of the 3 missing men from 1968. The physical evidence and documentation Ms. Kellerman recovered, combined with Whitmore Sterling's confession, gives us probable cause to pursue murder charges against Luther Hask, if he's still alive, and conspiracy charges against others who may have been involved in the cover-up. Marcus Sterling stood abruptly, his lawyer trying to pull him back, but he shook the man off and strode to the front of the room. This is a witch hunt, he declared, his voice tight with controlled fury. A bitter mechanic with a failing business, manipulating elderly people and exploiting my grandfather's final confused ravings to destroy a family that has contributed enormously to this region's prosperity. Is that why you came to my apartment and threatened to foreclose on my business? Roz asked calmly. Because this is all lies? The recording of your threats is now in federal hands, Mr. Sterling. Along with evidence that your family has known about the contamination for decades and done nothing to remediate it. You don't understand what you've done, Sterling said, his composure cracking. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs when the lawsuits start. Property values will collapse. This entire region will suffer because you couldn't leave the past buried. 3 men were murdered, Carlos Ortiz said, standing to face Sterling directly. My brother. His brother. Her brother. He gestured to Patricia and James. You want us to stay silent so your family can keep their fortune built on blood and poison? Those men died 50 years ago, Sterling shot back. Nothing we do now will bring them back. All you're accomplishing is destroying the present to punish the past. No, Roz said firmly. We're making sure the past finally gets justice. And we're preventing the future from being contaminated by secrets that should never have been kept in the first place. The aftermath. The press conference footage went viral within hours. National news outlets picked up the story of the dying billionaire's confession, the mechanic who exposed a 50-year cover-up, and the families finally getting answers about their disappeared loved ones. Within a week, the EPA had declared the Northern Ridge area a Superfund site, requiring extensive cleanup that would cost tens of millions of dollars. The Sterling family fortune would take the hit, with Marcus Sterling's companies facing both federal and civil liability. The FBI investigation moved quickly. Luther Hask, now 87 and living in a Nevada nursing home, was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. His deteriorating health meant he'd likely die before trial, but the charges sent a message that some crimes couldn't be outlawed by time. Marcus Sterling was charged with obstruction of justice for his attempt to intimidate Roz and suppress evidence. His seat on the county board was vacated, his business empire began crumbling under the weight of lawsuits and public backlash. But perhaps the most significant change was in Millbrook Ridge itself. The conspiracy of silence that had held the town in thrall for 50 years finally broke. People who'd suspected the truth but stayed quiet began coming forward with their own stories, their own pieces of the puzzle. The unexpected gift. 2 months after the press conference, Roz received a registered letter from a law firm in Helena. Inside was a document that took her breath away. Whitmore Sterling's will, updated in his final weeks, left the entirety of his personal fortune, separate from the family business, approximately $8 million, to the person who brings my confession to light and ensures justice for the men who died because of my cowardice. That person was Roz. The letter from Sterling's personal attorney explained, Mr. Sterling was very specific. He wanted to ensure that the person who had the courage to expose the truth would have the resources to weather whatever retaliation the Sterling family might attempt. He also hoped that this inheritance would help you rebuild what might be damaged in pursuit of justice. Roz sat in her garage office, staring at the letter. $8 million. Enough to save her business 100 times over. Enough to never worry about money again. But more importantly, it was validation from a dying man that speaking truth was worth the cost. She used the first portion of the inheritance to pay off her father's loans completely. The garage was finally free and clear. She hired back the mechanics she'd had to let go, upgraded equipment, and expanded services. But she also set up a foundation in partnership with the families of the disappeared men, the Brennan Greer Memorial Fund, dedicated to environmental justice and supporting families of workers killed in industrial accidents. Half of Sterling's inheritance went directly to that fund. The 1967 Ford F-250 that had started everything never got sold. Roz restored it completely, returned it to its original glory, and parked it permanently in her garage with a plaque explaining its history. It became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things aren't what they appear to be at first glance. 6 months later. On a warm May afternoon, Roz stood at the grand opening of the Kellerman Automotive Training Center, a new facility funded by the Sterling inheritance, dedicated to teaching young people the mechanical skills that were becoming rare in an increasingly automated world. Danny Ortiz was now her partner in the business, and his grandfather Carlos cut the ribbon alongside Patricia Greer and James Brennan. My father used to say that mechanics is about more than fixing broken things, Roz told the assembled crowd of students, community members, and press. It's about understanding how things work, why they fail, and having the patience to bring them back to life. But I've learned it's also about something else, having the courage to look beneath the surface and face whatever truth you find there, even when it's uncomfortable. She gestured to the restored Ford F-250, gleaming in the sunlight. This truck carried secrets for 50 years. It took a dying man's courage and a lot of people's determination to finally bring those secrets to light. But that's what we do here. We take things that look beyond repair and show that with skill, patience, and courage, they can be restored to something beautiful. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Roz received a phone call from an investigative journalist working on a book about the Sterling mining scandal. "I wanted you to know," the journalist said, "Luther Hask gave a full confession before he died last week. He admitted to all 3 murders, confirmed everything in Whitmore Sterling's confession, and implicated 2 other Sterling executives who helped cover up the crimes. The FBI is pursuing charges against their estates." After hanging up, Roz walked through her garage, running her hand along the workbenches her father had built, the tools he'd collected over a lifetime, the legacy he'd left her that was now secure and growing. She thought about Silas Brennan, who'd hidden evidence for 50 years, too afraid to use it but too principled to destroy it. She thought about Whitmore Sterling, who'd spent half a century as a coward before finding courage in his final weeks. She thought about her father, who'd taught her that some things mattered more than profit or safety. And she thought about that moment when she'd first opened the glove compartment of a rusted old Ford and found a business card and a notebook that would change everything. Sometimes, Roz reflected, the most important discoveries aren't the ones you're looking for. Sometimes they're the ones you find when you're brave enough to look closely at things other people want to keep hidden. Outside, the Montana sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Inside Kellerman's Automotive, a restored 1967 Ford F-250 sat gleaming under the lights, a testament to the truth that some things, machines, justice, and courage, can be brought back to life if you're willing to do the work. The truck that had carried secrets for half a century was finally free of its burden. And so was the town that had lived in its shadow for just as long.